Hey guys, welcome back to I think what will be part two of my Shovelhead engine build. Today what I wanted to talk about is the engine oil system, mostly because I had significant oiling issues on my engine, mostly to do with low oil pressure. My bike when I got it had one of these oil-filled mechanical pressure gauges, and unfortunately at no point did I ever see more than a couple of psi on this gauge. I did check the gauge with some compressed air, and it clearly works quite well. So yeah, I had low oil pressure, and after taking the motor apart, it's pretty clear that certain parts of the motor are being starved. So anyway, what I want to do today is kind of go through the system, talk a little bit about how it works, at least the way I understand it to work, point out some of the key components so people get a better idea of how this thing works, what goes on in it, etc., etc. So bear with me, I'm going to kind of talk through it. I made some notes so I don't miss anything, but it's inevitable that I do miss some stuff, so I look forward to some comments once you guys get a chance to watch this, especially from you expert engine builders out there. Anyway, I'll point out that one of the main things I did was buy myself a S&S billet oil pump, which is what you see here. I was told that this was one of the best pumps you can get, and despite having a very 90s look to it, which I think I will address later, it is a good pump, good quality, good gears, good everything, so I'm happy I bought it. The way the oil system works is as follows. Oil is gravity fed to the pump from the oil tank via a hose into this port. Now this oil pump is reconfigurable, as in you can choose whether you bottom feed it or top feed it. Because this is a chopper and just the way it's laid out, it makes more sense for this bike to get them fed from the bottom. So this is the feed and this is the scavenge, this is the return to the tank, oil tank. Anyway, oil is pressure fed, or gravity fed rather, into the pump and feeds this port here on the oil pump cover. Now this oil port corresponds to this section of the pump here, which is the gravity side of the pump. When you run the motor, the gears turn here, and as oil is gravity fed into this port and then fed through these gears, it is pressurized onto the pressure side of the pump. So this is the gravity side, this is the high pressure side. Now once the motor turns and oil's forced through the gears, due to the fact that there's a tight clearance against the wall and due to the fact there's a calculated clearance between the gears, a certain amount of oil pressure is made here. So this is the high pressure side. Now that pressure side is fed through the pump through a couple of valves. One is a check valve, which basically is just a low pressure spring on a ball bearing. And what that does is prevent engine oil from slowly creeping through the gears and filling your engine up with oil when the bike is not running. When the bike is running and the gears are spinning, that valve opens wide open and it goes through a second valve here, which is the pressure relief valve. And the way that works is that if you go above a certain pressure, which I'm not sure what it is, let's just say 30 psi, excess oil is dumped out through probably this port here. I believe it's this port here, or probably this one here actually, through this breather hose and just thrown back into the gear case. What happens next is that the high pressure oil that comes through this port corresponds to this cavity here. And that cavity lines up with this hole, which is probably the most important one on this face, because that is the main oil pressure feed to the entire engine. This hole corresponds to a cross-drilled hole through here that goes to many places in the engine. Let's just start with the timing cover, or I'm sorry, the gear case cover here. If you notice, when I pull this cover off, that same hole I was talking about here lines up with this hole here and is in fact cross drilled through the engine. This guy here corresponds to this hole in the gear cover. This one right here. Now if you notice, there's a couple of ports in the gear cover that go several places through the engine. But the important two are these two. This guy here, if you look closely, hopefully you can see that, there's a bushing with a hole in it. Now the factory cross drills this guy through that, and they put a hole in this bushing which feeds this bushing oil, high pressure oil from the pump. The pump therefore is pressurizing this little guy here on the crankshaft. See that hole? The crankshaft is hollow, but is capped at the tip so you don't bleed oil here. Oil is forced through the crankshaft and then feeds the main rod bearings in here, the big end of the rod, giving plenty of oil to those guys. The other port on the cover goes up to this bushing here, which is the camshaft end on the gear cover. So it lubricates the front of the cam, that surface there. After that, excess oil is thrown away, which winds up in the gear case here from the cam. That's one side of the port. That's the side that goes off to the gear case. This same port is also connected to a couple of other ports here. The first one we'll talk about is this guy. This guy is where you typically would mount an oil pressure gauge, as so. So that sees the full engine oil pressure here. That port continues through here and connects to this port here. That one there. And that's a really important port as well, because that would typically have a fitting, something like this guy, that goes off and feeds your rocker boxes. That rocker box is typically what you'd see on an old bike like this, is the external lines that go up to the rocker boxes are fed from this port here. And that of course goes up and feeds the rockers, the arms, the rods, all that stuff in your rocker boxes. Once it's up in the rocker box, we're going to bring out a rocker box housing. It fills up your rocker boxes with oil through that port, front and back rockers of course. Once these guys are well lubricated and fed, excess oil is bled back down through these pushrod tubes. Now I don't have pushrod tubes to show you, but I'm sure you guys all know what I'm talking about there. And then the oil falls through the pushrod tubes onto the tappet blocks and lubricates the tappets, the rods, and everything underneath it through gravity and return oil. The last thing to show you on the pressure side of stuff are these holes here on the tappet block faces, this guy and this guy, which basically correspond to this tappet block hole here that you'll see there, therefore feeding the tappet blocks. Now this is a 66 bike, and I believe 66s came with hydraulic tappets from the factory. I'm not exactly sure how those work in terms of how much pressure they see to keep them extended, and I'd like to know more about that. I'm still researching that and trying to figure that out. The other interesting part to talk about is, since we already talked about the rocker boxes and the heads, there is a port on the cylinder barrel here that corresponds to a hole that goes through the rocker box and the heads that return oil down through the barrel, through this port here on the face, which corresponds to some holes here on the block. And what happens there is that oil falls down through the barrel, comes down through this fitting here, or this feature here, and therefore lubricates the cylinder walls, and believe it or not, works its way up and lubricates the piston rings and the small end of the rods. That's pretty wild. If you notice in there, there's a bit of a V groove cast into the cases where I marked oil in. After all that happens, the oil's collected and falls into that little hole at the bottom of that guy, and therefore fills in the primary side Timken bearings and lubricates those. After those fill in with oil, you'll see that little hole at the bottom there. That's where the oil returns into the crankcase. I'll put my light in there. If you look deep in the crankcase on the far end in there, you'll see way in here there's something that looks like maybe a scraper. Well, that's exactly what that is. That thing scrapes the edge of the crank as it spins, like that, and it basically cleans up the oil that's slinging around the crankshaft. But that doesn't happen all by itself. It's assisted by what's probably the most interesting part of this oiling system, which is this breather valve. The breather valve is this gear here that rides inside of this bore. I don't know which way it turns. Doesn't matter right now. But if you look at that, that has a timed window that takes up maybe a little bit less than half of that bore, that is driven off of the camshaft. Now there's really important timing that happens here. The cam gear has a couple of timing marks that correspond to this gear, and it's important to time those correctly. I'm not going to do it for this demonstration, but you'll see marks here and also on the gear. And the reason why those are important is because that is timed to the upward and downward stroke of your pistons and your crank. So what happens there is that as the pistons go up and down in the bore, there's some timing happening here. As the piston comes down through the bore of the barrel, there's a pressure wave under the piston, basically air, that is pushed down through the barrel, creating a pressurized crankcase. And remember that scraper we were talking about earlier? Well, that scraper actually corresponds to a cavity that comes around the corner of the engine, through here, through this bore, and is opened up in the inside of that bore. So as the pistons start to reach towards the bottom or somewhere near the bottom, this gear is coming around and starting to fully open, allowing that pressure to push all the oil in the crankcase through that port, around, through here, and through this screen. Once it comes through the screen, it splashes all the gears in the gear case, basically throwing oil on the camshaft, throwing oil on everything in there, and keeping all this stuff well lubricated and oiled. Pretty neat, huh? After all that happens, oil is constantly falling to the bottom of the gear case. And if you noticed earlier on, there's a hole way at the bottom here on the oil pump mounting face that actually corresponds to a hole in here. And that is now the scavenge. This fills with oil probably to some degree. And gravity feeds this chamber, which corresponds to this chamber of the oil pump. This guy here. And as the gears turn, oil is pressure fed to the pressure side of the scavenge through this hole here, which corresponds to this cavity here on the cover of the oil pump, down through this port and to this, ultimately to this port here, which returns it to the oil tank. Now that's the majority of the oil system on a early shovel. It's probably really similar on pretty much every other Harley. There are a few other things that happen in this oil system that I don't quite fully understand yet. This is once again the cover. There's a pretty pronounced port in here that connects to this passage here and connects to this tube here that lines up with this guy here. Now these tubes do not meet end to end. They're actually separated by a screen that I don't have in place right now that sits in here. But I think what happens here is a little bit of air and oil separation. I want to read a little bit more about that. I'm not sure exactly. Anyway, I hope that helps understand the oil system on this engine a little bit better. Like I said, I was suffering from low oil pressure, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly why. There was significant wear on the tappets, and there was significant wear on this breather gear. I actually treated myself to a brand new S&S modified breather gear, and I immediately noticed that it fits a lot more snug in the bore. I still think the bore is standard, but that fits a lot nicer. I'm going to work my way through the assembly of this thing carefully, and I guess what you call that is blueprinting. But I'm going to try to see if I can get this thing to pump good oil pressure and live a long time. So I'm not going to really cover that in this video. I'm going to check a lot of clearances and stuff like that, hoping to solve the problem of the low oil pressure. Anyway guys, that's pretty much it. I guess I will mention one last thing before I go, is that these are the drive gears for the oil pump. These run off of the shaft on the oil pump, and S&S does recommend that you change the ratio. Currently it's 1 to 5, but they have a second gear set that's 1 to 4 that increases pump speed and gets a little bit more oil into the engine. So I'm trying to find a set of those. I don't have them yet, but that's one last important upgrade that I will be making, because I want good oil pressure to be able to take nice long rides and feel good about the way it runs. So anyway guys, I hope that helps. I would really love your comments on this video, especially from you guys that have done this many times and know this system better than I do. Hope that helps guys. Take care. Peace.